Welcome to episode 75 of the Camerosity Podcast, the world's #1 open source film photography podcast. My name is Mike Ekman, and we are back with another exciting episode. Tonight, we have a special guest to talk to us about one of the show's favorite camera brands. Author of the definitive Asahi Pentax Collector's Guide, 1952 to 1977, is none other than Gerjan van Oosten. Gerjan is someone I have collaborated with on previous Asahi camera reviews and is someone I have been eager to get a chance to speak with. And tonight, we are happy to have him on the show. For this show, we are short a host as Theo is vacationing in Vietnam, and in order to accommodate Gerjan's time zone, it is in the middle of the morning for Theo. But fear not, as both Paul and Anthony were able to make it for this special episode. We'll skip the usual introductions and get right to the show. All right, it looks like we have some people in the waiting room. Let's let them in. So we're going to be doing a special show today. A brand of cameras that we've spoken a lot about on the show is Pentax. Obviously, some great models from the screw mount Asahiflexes, the screw mount early Pentaxes, later on to the K-mount bayonet cameras. But when I've done a lot of research on Pentax cameras, there was always one book that I would always come back to. And that book is the Ultimate Asahi Pentax Screw Mount Guide, written by Gerjan van Oosten, who I've worked with before through email, and I've always wanted to speak to him and learn a little bit more about his history, have him share with us his knowledge of Pentax, Takumar lenses. There's so much to cover here. It's a great brand that myself and many listeners of this show love, but I want to let him introduce himself. So Gerjan, welcome. You want to introduce yourself, tell us kind of how you got in the background and what your thoughts are on Pentax or anything you think that's relevant.
Okay. Do you also want to know any personal things or?
Sure. Whatever you think you want to share. If you don't want to share personal stuff, that's fine. But, maybe I think people like to know, like why Pentax? Why did you get into them?
Yeah, okay.
Any fun stories you have?
I'll try to make it short because it's a long story. It all started around 1977 when I was very dissatisfied with the equipment I had. And a friend of mine said, why don't you try Takumar lenses? And the rest is history. And well, I started photo school, did my final exams with the Pentax, of course, ES2 and Spotmatic F, and 28, 50 and 105 millimeter lenses. And then I started collecting. First camera was an S2, and there was an auto Takumar 2.8-105 on that camera. And there was something wrong with that lens. One of the lens elements was a bit loose. So I tightened a ring, put on a drop of glue, and it was fixed. Well, since then, I'm stuck with Pentar. I'm fixed with Pentax. I'm very enthusiastic about the quality of the lenses, and I still am.
You're in the Netherlands. Where are you from? Like, where are you at right now?
I'm in the Netherlands, yeah.
But you said you were shooting something else back then. What was it that you were shooting prior?
I started serious photography with an East German Praktica LTL. With a 1.850 Pentacon lens on, and I was stupid to give it away, and I went to a franchise called Photo Quelle, which is big in Germany. At least it was big in Germany.
Sure.
And I bought an aperture priority screw mount camera and a fully manual camera with 3 lenses, 35, 50 and 135. And when I saw my first results, I was very disappointed. The lenses were not sharp and the contrast was horrible. And then my friend said, well, try Takumar lenses.
How easy was it to locate Japanese cameras like the Pentax and the Takumar lenses back then?
1977, Pentax had already introduced the K series and also the ME and the MX. So there was lots of second-hand equipment on the market.
Okay.
And when I was convinced that the lenses were great, I thought, well, why not buy the cameras as well?
Makes sense.
Which I did.
So thinking back to those first lenses, you mentioned the 105.
Yeah.
Let's pretend you were talking to somebody who is in a similar situation today. And, maybe it's somebody who is younger and they are only familiar with shooting digital, but they want to try either old film cameras or maybe they want to try some old vintage Takumar lenses, but shoot them digitally. What in your mind would be like an ideal kit for somebody who wants to get started with screw mount lenses, specifically ones made by Asahi?
Well, the thing he or she should do is buy an adapter that fits the particular camera.
Sure.
And even then, you may be very enthusiastic or you may be disappointed. I've heard lots of stories of people using Sony cameras who are not satisfied with the quality of Takumar lenses. But I have no Sony camera. I have Pentar camera.
But are there specific lenses though that you would recommend?
There are only 3 lenses which I would not recommend. I would not recommend the 18mm fisheye, and I would not recommend both 20mm lenses, either the Super Takumar or the Super Multi-Coated Takumar.
And why is that?
Well, the image quality of the fisheye is terrible. It's hardly sharp in the center, and on the edges, well, you might as well take a big splash of ink and put it on, because there's almost no image.
I have a copy of the fisheye, and it's a challenge to shoot. I mean, I have been able to get some satisfactory images, but it's just one step above being a pinhole lens. It's a beast to try to really nurse something out of that lens.
Anthony, where did you get that lens?
I got that from Paul Reibold.
Oh, you got it from me. I have to say it. I was really glad to get rid of that one. I tried it on the Sony, and I knew it wasn't anything that I was going to shoot.
Yeah, it's definitely an artistic lens. It's a special use lens, but it's not one that I'm like. It's the last of my Takumar lenses I'm going to reach for. You know, I really have to have a reason to want to shoot that lens.
What was the other lens that you mentioned? Were they the 40 millimeters?
The 20s.
Oh,
20s. The 20s. Okay.
20. Yeah. They have a double form of distortion. In the center, it's a barrel, and in the corners, it's changed to pincushion. So you get a kind of moustache distortion. And if you're into interior or architectural photography, you will be very dissatisfied. I would advise the 28mm because it's almost distortion free, less than 0.5%.
Can you talk a little bit about the 50 millimeter 1.48 element?
There are lots of stories about that lens. Some people are raving about it, and I say, well, okay, it's not bad, but it's not fantastic either. I prefer the 7 element.
Is the 8 element, is the mystique behind it the glass, the thorium or lanthanum glass, or what do you think it is that causes it to sell for such a premium price and be so in such demand?
Now, the 8 element has, as far as I know, has no thorium.
Okay.
But I have heard from some people on my Facebook group that say I have one that is slightly radioactive, but far less than the 7 element version.
Which one came first, the 7 or the 8?
The 8 came first. It was introduced along the Spotmatic in 1964, just before the Olympics in Tokyo.
So they probably, I assume, found a way to just simplify the design by cutting one of the elements out. Like that would explain why, because they only made the 8 for a short while. I know they're in high demand.
That's right.
But I think what Paul was asking is the mystique of having an extra element. I think people who don't know any better assume that it's going to magically be better, but that's not true, is what you're saying, right?
No. Well, in general, more elements mean you have more opportunities and more possibilities to correct lens errors.
Right.
It's not the holy grail.
Is there a holy grail in terms of Pentax lenses, like one that you really think is worth people going out of their way to look for?
I think there are several, but the 3.5-28 is my favorite.
Let's talk about the different kinds of cameras they had. Like I've always been interested in the history of a lot of these companies. And the story goes is that Asahiflex came out. It was originally designed in the early 50s. It was a camera that, well, for one, Asahi started making SLRs. They were the only Japanese camera company that started out making SLRs first. They didn't start with rangefinders. They never made a TLR.
No.
They didn't get into medium format until later. You know, usually it's the other way around. A lot of companies like Fujica, Ricoh, Minolta, they made a lot of roll film cameras earlier and then eventually moved to 35mm, whereas Asahi Pentax kind of went the other way around. And I'm a huge fan of those early Asahiflexes. I know, Anthony, you have one of the Sears Tower branded ones. And while I'll never suggest that Pentax SLRs feel cheap because they're all very good cameras, but there is a noticeable gem-like quality to the earlier cameras. And I'll even extend that to the very first Pentax, the original Pentax, the Pentax S and the original Pentax K. They just have a noticeable just feel. Like, I don't know how to describe it, but they're so wonderful to shoot. And I told a story, I don't want to repeat too much of it here, but a listener of the show had sent me a couple lenses. We were talking about a retina reflex lens that he wanted to send me, and so we agreed to it. And then in the box, it's like I threw a couple other things in there, and in that box was a Takumar. He's like, "Yeah, I just had this screw mount Takumar." He didn't think much of it, and when I opened the box and saw what it was, I could see it was the original non-auto, just the original preset Takumar M42 mount for the original Pentax camera. And I said to him, like, this is an OG lens. Like, this is the original screw mount lens for that first Pentax. And I didn't have a body to attach it to that was period correct. So, of course, gas struck me like it does everybody. And I went out and bought a nice looking, but, for parts only, the shutter was shot, the curtains were all screwed up body. And I thought I'd be happy to just have the correct body to display the lens on. But even though it wasn't working, it just kind of had that heft and that feel, that gem-like quality that I like from those earlier cameras. I couldn't handle not having it working, so I ended up sending it out to be CLA'd, got new curtains put in, everything. So now it works perfectly. And when I handle that camera versus I have an Asahiflex 2A, they just feel like they're a step up in quality from later ones. Is it just in my head, or is there anything to that, to where maybe the earlier Pentaxes or Asahiflexes were more handmade or something? Maybe they were a smaller company and just didn't cut any corners, or is it just all my head?
It may be true, but I really don't know. The only thing I know is that when the 2A and 2B were in production, they were only producing one body casting in which they put the slow shutter speed, or they did not. And the location of the slow shutter speed button was covered with a piece of leatherette.
Right.
And that's the way to discern between the 2B Model 1 and 2B Model 2.
Okay.
Which is written in my book.
Well, I have a question about the Asahiflex lenses. I've got the Tower 22, which I believe is a 2A, and it's got the 58 millimeter, which I understand that's a Heliar design.
Yeah. Correct.
Absolutely love that lens. I mean, it's really just a special lens.
It is a special rendering. That's right.
They never really introduced a later Takumar version of that lens, did they?
Yes, there is an M42 version of that lens also.
Oh, there is.
Yeah, but there is a caveat, because late in production they put in the glass of the 2.255, but still they put on the index ring and at the front saying 2.485.
Huh.
I don't have that particular version, but sometimes they pop up here and there. So you have to look very carefully to know whether it's the right one or it's the false one.
It's such a special lens. I'm surprised that didn't become like a more prominent lens in their line later on down the way, because it is special.
It is special, yeah. But it was very soon replaced with the 2.255 or the 255, and then the 1.855.
If I can go back to something you mentioned earlier, you mentioned that you liked the 28 millimeter, right?
Yeah.
Which version?
In principle, the super multi-coated version, because it is better resistant to flare.
Yeah.
But the Super Takumar is also nice. I will show you the Super Takumar.
I've got the SMC 3.5 that I use on my Pentax ES.
Yeah.
And I love
One
that
of the
lens.
best lenses.
It's probably the best 28 millimeter that I have.
Yes. There was an earlier Super Takumar version which had a bigger filter mount, 58 millimeter, which was bigger and heavier than the later one. And the later one, I think, is better in sharpness and contrast.
Yeah. Have you shot that, Mike?
I have not, no. I have one, and it's not in the best of shape, but I haven't had a chance to try it. Commenting on your praise for the 58-24, I definitely agree. It's just, there's something special about that lens. Like, it's a combination of just the right amount of sharpness, the right amount of contrast, pleasing out of focus details. The only thing that I don't love about it is that for my eyes, the way that I mentally frame a picture in my head, 58 millimeters is just slightly too long for me. I always tend to lean more towards slightly wide. Like I feel like 40 millimeter is my perfect what my mind's eye sees things. So I do tend to struggle with framing on a 58 millimeter, but I mean, other than that's just personal preference. But other than that, though, and then I'm sure they exist. Maybe Rare Adapters has one. I don't have any M37 to M42 adapters because I haven't had a chance to shoot that lens on any other body other than the Asahiflex.
Talking about the longer focal length, you see the same with Minolta and Konica. They had 57 and or also 58 millimeter lenses in the beginning. That is.
Well, and then speaking of 58 millimeter lenses, I guess I'll reveal this here. We talk about gas. This show likes to convince people to buy stuff that they hear us talk about. But unfortunately, that gas affects us too, the hosts. And in the last episode, we were talking about Nikkor lenses, and Paul professed his love for the 5814 lens, the original lens that came on the Nikon F. And I just was intrigued because I've never so much as even seen one before. And all of the other lenses I have are the 50 millimeter. And I ended up locating a decent 5814 with it was a little bit cheaper because it had a dented filter ring, but nothing too bad. I was able to kind of straighten it out a little bit. But it's another one of those 58 millimeter lenses. And the cool thing is I have a Nikon F with the sports finder, and maybe that just kind of like helps me with the framing a little bit better on it than holding up to my eye. But 58 millimeter for people like me, it's just longer enough that you do notice it. And you're right, that was a much more common focal length in the early days of SLR shooting. I had read, and maybe you have more insight to this than I do, but the reason they chose that specific focal length was the earlier reflex screens on early SLRs were just a little bit darker, and they thought that by making the lens just slightly longer would help people see focus a little bit easier on the ground glass by using a slightly longer lens than something a little bit narrower. I don't know how much truth there is to that or if it's just a convenience, but you do notice that the 58 millimeter lenses tended to disappear by the early 60s.
Yeah, that's right. And you may be right on that, but I can concur, because if I take my early Takumar F4 35 millimeter, the viewing screen is absolutely too dark to focus unless you are in the bright sunshine.
Yeah.
It's a nice lens to look at, but it's not a real joy to take pictures with, especially on old cameras.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that lens, because when we did the show announcement, one of our listeners, Colin Hibbard, wanted us to ask you if the Takumar 35 millimeter F4, if that's a sonar formula. I looked it up in your book, and it's 5 elements and 4 groups.
Yeah, that's right.
So it is a sonar formula?
Well, it really is a retrofocal lens. If you look very carefully, you will see it's really a very small standard lens with a big negative element in front.
Yeah, you can see the grouping is you get the 4 elements all squished together with this huge element spaced way out in front of it.
But talking about the book you showed in the introduction is my first book from 1999, and it's completely sold out. You may find it on Amazon for absurd prices like $100 or even more, $300 I've seen. In 2021, I made a reviewed copy of that book, which, well, I would dare to say 80% of the text is new, but that book is also sold out. But last year, I made a reprint of that book with some improvements, and those are still for sale.
So that's the 2023 version. You can get them straight from you?
Yeah, or on eBay. Here it is.
If they buy it on eBay, are they still getting it from you? Like, are you benefiting from that?
Is it your eBay store? You're selling it yourself on eBay?
Yes.
Okay. We just want to make sure. We want to make sure the sale goes directly to you.
It's my own private product.
Gotcha.
I had it print by a printer, of course, but I made it on my computer.
So what we'll do is when we post this show, we have show announcements. I'll find a link to your eBay store and I'll include it there so that people can get the 2023. So I had asked you this question before, but I wanted to repeat it here. You use the same cover for
No,
all three?
no, not really.
You don't?
No, not really. The first book had a colored camera in front, and now it's black and white. Only the Asahi Pentax lettering is red.
I see. I mean, you could just look at the copyright date, though, right? Is another way to tell. But what I'm trying to do is help people differentiate between making sure they get the most recent version.
The first book is called the Ultimate, and the second book and the third book are called the Definitive.
Okay.
Asahi Pentax Collector's Guide.
All right, that's a nice trick.
And the most recent print from 2023 has my name on the cover, and the 2021 does not have my name on the cover. So it's very easy to discern between the three books.
Okay, that's good to know. We had a couple people join. I want to see if they have any questions. Pat Casey's here. Pat's been on the show a bunch of times. But Wayne, anytime we do a European show, Wayne takes advantage of it and joins us. So Wayne, welcome back. Do you want to say hi?
Hi. Yeah, glad to be able to join you guys. Finally, another Euro episode.
Yeah, we do the Euro episodes from time to time. We normally record at 7:00 Central Time in the US, which for Middle Europe is, in the middle of the night. So we wanted to accommodate, a little bit earlier of a recording. So I don't know, Wayne, did you have any questions for Gerjan?
I know you mentioned you're the SLR expert, but Mike mentioned the lack of rangefinders. Was there ever a plan to convert, or even was the original plan to make a rangefinder from Pentax?
No. Mr. Saburo Matsumoto, who was the president in the 1950s, was looking at the camera market, and he saw rangefinder cameras and he saw twin lens reflex cameras, and he decided, well, that's not what I'm going to make. I will not become one of the unknown and nameless manufacturers. I will create a single lens reflex camera because I think there's much more of a future. And Pentax still follows that principle. They made a K01 and they made some small cameras like the Q series, but that's really, and of course the 645 and the 67, but no rangefinders, no twin lens reflexes, and I don't think they ever will. And mirrorless, well, they say we don't do that, but you never can tell.
So to go back to the early SLRs, the numbering is a little confusing for a lot of people because you had one numbering for Japan and one numbering for the US. The H1A was what was the designation for that camera in Japan? Was it an S3 or an S?
Now things start to be complicated because I have an Asahi Pentax S2, but I also have an Asahi Pentax H2.
Okay, so the H's are not necessarily exclusively for the US.
Unless it is a Honeywell or a Highland.
Mm-hmm.
Then those cameras are all named H. H2, H3, H1, or H1A. And the SV in America was called H3V.
Okay.
And there was a plan to call the Spotmatic H4, but then they found out that the pronunciation of the number 4 in Japan sounds like the Japanese word for death. And then they thought, well, let's not do that.
So on those early cameras, on those particular models, the lens it came standard with was a semi-automatic lens. Is that correct? They had a stop down lever on the lens itself to reopen it between each shot.
That's the second line of lenses. They started with preset lenses.
Okay, so they were preset only at the very early versions.
Yeah, with the Pentax K, which is the Pentax, I think, 29 in the States. That was the first camera with a semi-automatic lens, Auto Takumar 1.855.
Okay. Did they make the lens that I'm trying to remember which one it is? I'm thinking it was a 50 millimeter 2.4, but I'm questioning whether that's really correct. Did they make a 2.4?
They made a 2.4 58 in M42.
Okay, that's what I'm thinking of.
That lens is identical to the lens on the Asahiflex, except then for the mount.
My experience, that lens is really a very, very good lens.
Yeah, but as I explained earlier, in late production, they replaced the glass with the glass of the 2.255. So you may find a lens which you think is a 2.485, but it in reality is a 2.255.
You said 85, but you meant 58, right?
Sorry, yeah, 58, of course.
Okay. Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, in Dutch, we say 85 or 58. It's just the other way around.
That's fine. Yeah, my only preset lens is the 58 f2. I don't have the 58-24 in M42. The only 58-24 I have is in my Asahiflex.
Yeah,
That's interesting. They made both mounts, so they made it both Asahiflex
Right.
and M42.
yeah.
So can you explain, like, when you hear the term preset to someone who doesn't understand what that means, what the difference is?
That's not too difficult. There are two rings, two aperture rings, and one ring serves to open and close the aperture, and the other ring serves to preset the aperture you want to use.
People are used to automatic diaphragms, which is when you can set the aperture ring to whatever you want,
Yeah.
and it doesn't stop down to that until the moment you press the shutter release.
Yeah.
Now, some people do differ on this. I say semi-automatic. Those are the lenses that have a manual lever on the lens itself.
Yeah, they're called Auto Takumar.
Auto Takumar, right. So you have to pull, like Yashica made lenses like that. There were a few other companies that made it where there's a lever on the physical lens itself.
Yashica did.
Yeah, only when you move that lever down will it actually open up. But if you don't use that lens, it's essentially automatically stopped down no matter what you choose.
My Zeiss lenses for my Exacta VX are like that as well.
Yep. Theirs is on the bottom though, isn't it? Like it's a little lever on the bottom.
Yes.
Anthony, yeah.
Some are on the bottom and some are on the side. The advantage to me I like a preset lens because personally I leave them wide open. Leave it set for actually set it for the smallest aperture, like f16. And then I use the close down ring to get it to the aperture I want. So it's clickless. You can go anywhere in between. It
Yes.
makes it very easy to make a precise adjustment for the f-stop on a preset lens.
You can even set half f-stops.
Yep, easily, and it's very precise. And on the semi-automatic lenses, the lever simply opens it up to the widest aperture.
Right.
And that's so that it's easier for you to focus it. You could leave it stop down if you want. It'll be dark.
The camera will push the pin and then it will close to the aperture you've chosen.
I briefly mentioned Yashica, and Yashica didn't make their own lenses. That most of them were Tomioka's, but they did use a couple other companies. But when I look at, I have a Yashica Pentamatic, which was their first ever SLR from 1960, and it has a Yashinon semi-automatic lens on it too. And side by side, it looks very similar to the Takumars. Is that just a coincidence, or are you aware of any collaboration that Asahi would have had with Yashica or Tomioka or whoever was making their lenses?
There are lots of stories about this phenomenon. I found a Japanese website where one of the people had dismounted both the Takumar and the Yashinon lens, and seeing details, I would say no, they did not cooperate, but both must have looked what the other had done. There are similarities, but there are also differences.
Okay.
Focusing on the Yashica is in the opposite direction to Pentax, just to mention one.
I never noticed that. I'm not doubting you. I just have to look. Yeah, he's right. It's like Nikon is always usually backwards.
Yeah, and the lever is also different. It has a different shape.
Yeah, the levers are different. It's just, I mean, the colors, I can't really show it here too, but just the layout.
The Yashica lens is 50 millimeter and not 55 millimeter.
Yeah. All right. Well, I could answer that question without asking you, but I thought it'd be a fun topic. Patrick Casey.
Yes.
How you doing, man?
I am good. Thanks. And just one thought when you were mentioning why the 58 millimeter lenses back in the day, I thought part of that was in order to get a long enough focal length to clear the mirror, so they wouldn't have to go to some sort of retro focus. I don't know if there's anything to that. I just remember hearing that somewhere.
I think the problem starts with 35 millimeter only.
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure whether there were lenses that were protruding much to the back. I had one lens, it was a Zeiss lens, a Tessar 2.850, which collided with the mirror of my Spotmatic F. It was a very old lens from a Praktica FX, as I remember well.
I know it's another topic is why 50 millimeter is the standard and not like 43 or 45. I understand that's an interesting story. Mainly, I understand it's because Oscar Barnack liked 50 or something like that.
That may be true, but as far as I know, the first 50 millimeter lens designs were based on inches, which is 2 inches. So that would
2
be
inches.
52.5 or 53 millimeter.
Okay.
And the manufacturers may deviate from the real focal length. I have 83 millimeter lens, Takumar, but it might have been sold as 85 millimeter also. And 43, well, Pentax did make a 43 millimeter in a bayonet mount autofocus, and then the focal length is equal to the image diagonal of a full frame camera.
Sure.
There's so many examples of lenses from that era which were sold as 5 centimeters or 50 millimeter, and they really weren't. They were a little bit off from that. I think it just depended on how honest the manufacturer wanted to be. Konica made a 52 millimeter for quite a while.
Yeah.
There's a couple Soviet lenses which are 52 millimeter. Kodak actually in the 30s on the Kodak 35 had a 51 millimeter lens. So I just think that that's truth in advertising maybe, but is the average person, especially considering in an SLR, very few SLR viewfinders are truly 100%. There's a little bit missing from the viewfinder anyway than what's captured on film. So there's kind of like that margin for error where are you really going to tell the difference between a 48 millimeter and a 51 millimeter and a 52? I think 55, 58, you're now starting to get slightly a little bit more where you're going to see just a tad bit more separation due to narrower depth of field, a little bit longer. That's where I think you could see it. But in that sort of sweet spot from like 48 to 52 millimeter, I think all lenses are just somewhere in that range.
You would have to make a setup with a tripod and then try any focal length you want, and then compare the results. And even then you will say, I don't care.
So I want to try and stump you. I know you know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. But I have an H2. So I'll show you this H2. You can see H2 there, right? Except it's not a Pentax. It's an Asahiflex.
Yeah.
What is an Asahiflex H2?
It's really is an Asahi Pentax H2, but it was sold in countries where Asahi Pentax had a problem with the name giving.
So was it just somewhere else in Europe, or
Finland,
do you know where?
South Africa, just to mention a few. Pentacon had a prototype camera that was called Pentax.
Yes, I've seen pictures. I've never seen one in person before. So did they have to license that name then, and they bought it but just couldn't get it for every part of the world then?
I really don't know. There are all kinds of stories.
And then I have another H2, which is a Pentar.
Yeah, same story.
That's the same thing, same story. Okay.
Yeah.
So they either just chose to sell them as Pentars or Asahiflexes,
or even Pentar Asahiflex. There are lots of different names.
Weird ones. Okay. So collectors like to have those strange anomalies then.
So I have a question. And this is more for listeners that find it confusing that the Takumar lenses went through these iterations. And so to just sort of slow walk through what is available so people understand. First, we had the auto Takumars, which are the preset lenses.
If it's a preset, it doesn't say auto. It just says Takumar.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
And then you had the auto Takumar. Then you had the Super Takumar, which could be shot with the auto mode or the manual mode. And it also had the different coding. And then you had the Super Dash Multi-Dash coded. And then you had the SMC. And so the difference was they were changing the codings as they went along, and they were changing, how that preset mechanism worked. And so they worked with different cameras. Are all the lenses backwards compatible? So can you put an SMC on a camera that was designed for the auto Takumar?
Yeah, in principle, yes, you can.
Okay. So if you're new to this and you're looking at lenses, perhaps if you have a camera that requires an auto Takumar, you could not use an SMC. Is that true?
In principle, it should work, but there are cases known of auto Takumar lenses, which are really Super Takumar lenses that will not perform well on the Pentax K.
Oh.
Because the push plate that activates the pin on the rear is not moving far enough. On my Pentax K, it's working just fine. But you can remove the mirror housing and you can adjust the push plate. You can push it a bit forward or a bit backward.
That's interesting. And then, I had friends that used to have a podcast called the Classic Lens Podcast. And, they would get caught up on sort of the minutia of the quality of the lenses. And they had definite opinions that even though Asahi would have variations of the same formula through those different styles of lenses, they had definite opinions that certain ones were of higher quality than others, so there might be, a 35 that they only liked as an SMC, or a 50 that they preferred as a Super Takumar. And then they wanted nothing to do with the K-mount lenses because they felt that once it made the jump from N42 to K-mount, that the formulas were never as precise or never as sharp. And I was wondering if you had an opinion as to, is there like a golden, like a sweet spot where you think that they had, the best combination of perhaps size and quality, or whether or not it really didn't matter because it is fundamentally the same formula with these tweaks as they changed manufacturing styles. Do you have an opinion about that?
It's a bit of a gray area because there are lenses in K-mount, in early K-mount, that are equal to Takumar lenses, like the 58, the 135, and in the beginning, probably also the 50 and 55 millimeters. But the latest 1.8 55 SMC Takumars are radioactive. But I have a K-mount 1.8 55 that's definitely not radioactive. So they must have started using different glass at a certain time. And I've also heard of people that had super multi-coated Takumars that are not radioactive, but mine are. Yeah, you tell me. I don't know. I don't know for sure.
Has anybody here attempted to de-yellow some of the yellowed lenses before? I know there's a lot of theories on how it could be done. I've spoken about getting one of the high intensity UV lights that Ira Cohen is a dentist, and he commented that those can be used to harden fillings, but I think the primary use for them today is for people who get into 3D printing. They get these UV lights that help cure the plastic to make them harder faster. But I've had pretty good luck. I had a Canon 35 f2 lens that I de-yellowed, a couple Pentacon lenses. I haven't tried any of my Takumars because none of them are that bad to where I want to risk messing anything up. Not that I ever have, but it's something you can try with an actual UV light. Some people will say stick it in the sun, and whether or not that works, I would suspect it would take weeks.
Don't put them in the sun. Absolutely don't. The lens will heat up and grease from the focusing mechanism will go where you don't want it to go.
Right.
I know people that use a very small IKEA white spot to clear lenses. I use UV.
Yeah, the UV LED lights.
Any intense light will make the yellowing disappear.
The key is to not heat it up, like you said, in the sun. Yeah. If you do use a light that puts off some heat, just make sure it's like not physically touching the lens and that you have good ventilation, and you should be fine. But yes, I agree with you. I would think that
shine the light from the rear, not from the front, because the element is at the back.
Oh,
and
okay.
I know people putting tin foil on the front to make the light bounce back. It doesn't help because there is so much glass in between. The light will do almost nothing.
All right, so I have one more question about, now this is a prototype, and hopefully you know at least something about it because it infinitely intrigues me. But there was once, and I swear I'm not making this up, but there was once a camera called the Pentax Metalica, just like the Hard Rock Band. And
there were even two Metalicas.
There were two Metalicas, right? They were both prototypes. I know a little, but I'd rather hear it from you. What do you know about those cameras?
They were shown at Photokina in Cologne, in Germany, in the 1960s. One of those cameras had a selenium cell on the front of the prism to measure the light. Of course, it was not taken into production because it's not very well. That's the Pentax Metalica from 1960.
Right.
And there was another Metalica, that's the Metalica 2, which dates back to 1966. That camera is based on the Spotmatic. If you see the camera, you clearly see the lines of the Spotmatic. And the ES and the ES2 are based on that particular camera because it had aperture priority.
But doesn't the name metal, doesn't that refer to a metal, like a copal square shutter or something similar? It wasn't a cloth shutter.
Yes, there was a metal shutter, vertically running metal shutter with a top speed of 1/2000.
Which is exactly the specifications of Konicka's very first SLR, which came out in 1960. It also had a vertically running metal blade shutter. It's not, a lot of people say that it's an early version of the copal square. They are not the same. There's too many differences to even
It may have
suggest.
been made by Psycho, but I'm not sure.
So the original Metallica was 1960.
Yeah.
It had a vertically running metal blade shutter. Didn't it also have a bayonet mount?
Yes, it did. Some sort of bayonet mount.
Right. So had they gone through with that, we may have seen a switch from screw mounts to bayonet lenses much sooner.
Yes. Now the official statement of Pentax is we didn't have the tools and we had a financial issue, so we didn't. And I think they were too successful with selling Spotmatics and ES2s and Spotmatic F's camera. But I think they were a bit lazy. They should have come with a bayonet mount very much earlier.
We've talked about in one of the earlier shows about that transition, whether or not they did it too late. And I guess the answer to that question depends on what you think their priority was at the time. If Asahi had strived to compete with Nikon and Canon and maybe even Minolta with a top tier SLR, then yeah, they definitely would have needed a switch sooner. But I think that they were content with where they were at in the market. I mean, they weren't top of the line, but they weren't bottom of the line either. I mean, Pentax cameras were very good. And your experience, how you started off in 1977 with some used glass, I think that's how a lot of people got exposed to Pentaxes, because there's a lot of people that love those cameras, including the Beatles. The Beatles, Paul McCartney was a big Pentax fan. So there's a lot of stories of people. And Ringo. Yeah. They
all four of them used Pentax SV.
The SV, yeah, there you go. The SV actually was my very first screw mount Pentax. I've added quite a few to the
There are pictures of Paul McCartney with an SV and a 1.885 millimeter lens.
I have a question. Honeywell in the United States, were they purely a marketing company? I know they made flash units, but were they purely a marketing company and they thought that the name Honeywell would sell better than the name Asahi? I've never completely understood why they decided to brand the camera with their name.
Well, sales in America started with Sears, Roebuck and Company from Chicago. Or is it? Now, it's Sears, Roebuck and Company. And somewhere in the 1950s, the Highland subdivision of Honeywell took over. So you had Honeywell Highland Pentax cameras. And a few years later, Honeywell took over itself. And Honeywell is basically an electronic company.
When I was growing up in Florida in the 1970s, there was a Honeywell factory a couple of miles from where I lived, and they manufactured missile components. They were an aerospace division of Honeywell. And so I was always surprised because growing up, I always thought of Honeywell as making ICBMs or, guided missiles. I didn't think about them as being a camera company. So the first time I saw a Honeywell Pentax, I was very confused.
They were the distributor for the North American market, which includes USA and Mexico. Canada had its own import. And I think in Canada, cameras were sold as Asahi Pentax and not as Honeywell Pentax. I have price lists from Canada that's clearly say Asahi Pentax, no Honeywell.
I knew Honeywell. I mean, not that I was alive then, but in my earliest experience with that brand is some of their earlier computers. They were big into technology and computing and such like that. I honestly think they had a similar marketing or distribution as like Bell and Howell did for Canon.
Oh yeah.
There were a few other Honeywell cameras that weren't made by Pentax. I know they did make a couple 126 cameras. I think there's a Honeywell rangefinder. I'm going to search for it real quick. It was called the Visimatic, but that's clearly not made by Pentax. I doubt that they made it themselves. If I'm just looking at a picture of it, it kind of looks like a Mamiya, maybe, which Mamiya made things for everybody.
At some point, did Asahi take over marketing the cameras themselves in North America and took it away from Honeywell?
No, they started in North America by selling the cameras themselves.
Oh,
and then Sears and Roebuck came in.
sure.
So the Sears tower cameras, they started with the original Asahiflex and they continue that through the earliest Pentax. So what, maybe 1960-ish is about when they got out of that market. If you were a customer of Sears Roebuck in the 1950s and you wanted a higher end Japanese camera, if you bought an SLR, it was probably a Pentax. But if you bought a rangefinder, it was probably a Nikka. Because those were, I mean, I know they did sell other brands too, but those were the primary manufacturers of tower branded SLRs and rangefinders in the 1950s.
And what about Canon and Nikon?
I don't think Sears distributed them though.
I don't know.
I was talking just for Sears Roebuck Company.
And wasn't Nikon EPOI from a real early point? Ehrenreich
Yeah,
photo.
Joseph Ehrenreich. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ehrenreich not only helped distribute Nikon in the United States, but he was very influential with the Nikon headquarters back in Tokyo in getting them to, like, steering them towards what he could sell. In fact, I think Bob Rodoloni has referenced a couple times that it was really Joe Ehrenreich's influence that drove Nikon away from making rangefinders towards SLRs. I don't think their original plan was to give up on rangefinders as quickly as they did, but the Nikon F was selling so well, and Ehrenreich wanted them so many. Like he had more customers than he had supplies. He essentially demanded, look, I need more SLRs. I need more SLRs. And at that time, Nikon was still a very small company. Nippon Kugaku, I believe they were still working out of a single factory. And there was just only so much capacity that they had. And Ehrenreich said, I can't sell the rangefinders as well as I can sell the Nikon F. So that's why you saw, the SP came out in 57. Then they had the S3 and the S4, which came out shortly after that. And technically they did have prototypes for an SP2 and one called the SPX in the early 60s. So, it didn't shut down rangefinder development completely, but you can definitely see a quick drop off of rangefinder production with them and a switch to the SLRs. And that was primarily Joseph Ehrenreich driving that.
One disadvantage of rangefinder cameras is the limited range of focal length.
Right. Unless you're willing to go to the reflex housings.
And but that's not a very handy solution.
No, it's definitely not.
But if you put a Nikon F next to a Nikon rangefinder, you can see that there are many similarities between the bodies.
Yes. The SP and the F, if you take away the mirror housing and the prism, they're about 95% the same.
Yeah.
Same shutter, same film loading mechanism, the dial, the lever, a lot of similarities.
Location of the shutter button.
Right.
Which is above the sprocket.
What about in the United States, Herbert Kepler? He was Mr. Pentax. I always did he actually? I understand he actually worked or he went back to the factory several times. He didn't just write about them, but he had some. I don't know if he had any input, but what was his role in the Pentax story?
I don't know what his role is. I only know he wrote several books on Pentax. I have several copies of several different printouts also, even a German version. I followed his example because he always tested lenses on a brick wall just to check for distortion and to check for sharpness in the corners and the edges.
Yeah, he was a big player in both modern photography and then popular photography magazines in the United States. So
I read both magazines, but they were available in the Netherlands.
Oh, really? Oh.
Yeah. Now, I was about to say that there was a famous Dutch photographer called Wim Broekman, and he wrote 3 books about Pentax also, starting with screw mount and later with bayonet and the M-type cameras.
I have one more question about like Pentax lore, which is sort of it's right there in our faces, but not many people really connect the dots that the Pentax Spotmatic doesn't do spot metering.
It doesn't.
Was that like something that they had tried to do and just gave up on it, or was it just a poor choice of a name for a camera?
No. On the same Photokina of 1960, they presented the Pentax Spotmatic, Spot-Matic, and it really had spot metering. There were several prototypes, and one of the prototypes I know about is there was a moving arm that went under the focusing screen when you wind the film. It looks a bit like the moving arm on the Leica CL and the Leica M5, which pop up when you wind the film. It wasn't very reliable, the system, and they also thought it would be too difficult for amateur photographers to use spot metering. So they changed the whole thing. They put 2 CDS cells next to the viewfinder, and those 2 cells measure the entire focusing screen. So there's no spot metering, no center weighted. It's just average metering of the whole picture area.
Was there ever, did they ever incorporate spot metering? I'm trying to think. I don't think the ES2 could do it.
No.
The LX, maybe?
Yes, but even on the KX and the K2, it was a bit center weighted.
Okay.
And on the LX, it went even further. And on the ME and the MX, it also went a step further.
So you're talking almost 20 years before you would actually see anything close to spot metering in a Pentax body. I always thought that was interesting. It's called the Spotmatic, yet there's nothing spot about it.
No, they kept the name because it sounds good, I think.
I mean, I would have preferred Metallica, but hey, that's just me.
Yeah, but then you would like to have a metal shutter, but it isn't in. And they were extremely successful with the Spotmatic because they sold almost 1.8 million copies of that particular camera.
So I'm curious if you have an opinion about where Pentax stands today. Now, I shoot a Pentax K1, the DSLR, which I think is a fantastic camera. I think it's extremely underrated. Yep. And I know that of the current lenses, they have their special edition lenses for the full frame cameras, and they're fantastic lenses. They're perhaps not the innovators that they used to be, but what's your opinion about like the current state of Pentax? Maybe even with their plans, they've reintroduced the half frame Pentax 17 with perhaps plans to extend that to a full line of film cameras, hopefully. I was just wondering if you had an opinion about has Pentax lost it, or are they just sort of hanging on, or do you think that they have a future?
Looking at the annual reports, the financial annual reports, Pentax is doing very well. I have a K1, I have a K1 Mark II, I have a Pentax KP, I have a K33 monochrome, and I have a Q7. I think Pentax is alive and kicking.
I really want one of those monochromes because I understand why you want to shoot a black and white digital camera, and I love my Pentax cameras, and that's kind of a camera that I lust after.
It's a very, very capable camera. Absolutely very capable.
So do you use the M42 lenses on those cameras? Adapted, of course.
From time to time, yes.
But you also use the autofocus lenses.
Yeah, of course. The Takumar lenses have a very different rendering from modern lenses. So sometimes I feel like, oh, now I want to use a Takumar lens. So I put on the adapter. I have even used oldest lenses from the Asahiflex on my K1. And the lens is sharp, a bit soft, but you can increase the contrast in your photo editor software. And sharpness is very fine. And that's the nice thing about Pentax. You can use any lens that they ever made on the latest digital camera.
They're like Nikon in that regard, where they've held on to. I mean, I guess they did switch from screw to K mount, but they have probably one of the longest lineages of backwards compatible lenses.
Even more so than Nikon.
Right, because they go back pre-59.
Yeah.
Before we're going to start winding down, before we go, though, wanted to kind of open it up with everybody who's here. Is there anything interesting that you've been shooting, or any projects or anything that you've done? I know, you've had quite a few successes with some cameras and some photos you shared with us.
You had loaned me the Horseman convertible, which is just such a weird camera. On one hand, it's barely more sophisticated than a box camera.
Right.
It's a super compact modular 6x9 wide angle camera. So it's sort of like, you think of like the Hasselblad SW, the wide angle Hasselblads. But it's 6x9, and I mean, it doesn't even have a viewfinder. It's just sort of literally point it in the general direction, and it's wide enough. And you just hope you get what you get, and you're zone focusing because again, there's no rangefinder on it. But the combination of 6x9 with that wide angle lens, shockingly cool results. Every time I shoot a roll with that film and I look at how it renders, I'm blown away by how cool that camera is. But at the same time, I don't think I've ever had a complete roll where I've gotten 8 exposures because it's so crude that it has no double exposure preventiveness. So you shoot, and if you don't remember to wind immediately, and then you go to shoot an hour later, and it's like, did I wind it on or not? And because sometimes, like when I tried to shoot the SpaceX rocket launch with it, and I was shooting so fast that I had multiple exposures because I just forgot to wind it. I would just recock it and shoot again. So on one hand, I wish it was just sophisticated enough that it had a rangefinder, or just sophisticated enough that it had double exposure preventiveness to it. But when it does work, my God, it delivers really cool results.
From what I've seen of your results, Anthony, I would think the double exposure prevention and don't press the shutter release with the dark slide in feature would help you much more than a rangefinder would. Because one of the pictures he shared with Paul and I is you were in a church and you just like haphazardly leaned up against a pulpit and took a 2-second exposure of a church organ, and it came out beautiful.
I know, it's stunning. It was an old rough-hewn pine pulpit, that wasn't exactly level. And I just sort of pressed it down as hard as I could. And I had to put it on bulb mode because it doesn't have a 2-second exposure. And I was just, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, let go. And it looks like I set it up with a tripod and professional lighting. Sure. I mean, it's just the rendering on it is spectacular.
Right. I mean, aside from remembering not to double expose and not to leave the dark slide in, you almost have to try not to get good images from it.
Yeah, actually, it's funny because I posted a photo on Instagram of the camera today, and I have a piece of painter's tape on the top with the big black arrow pointing to the dark slide.
Yeah.
So to remind me to take it out. And as Paul said, it's like once you're loaded, if you're not changing backs, I just leave the dark slide out anymore. I pull it, I get to my shooting location, I pull it out, put it in my camera bag in a little side pocket, and then don't put it back in until I'm done with the roll. Because before I started doing that, I did I shot 5 out of 8 shots with the dark slide in, and then had to take the film out, wind it back in a dark bag, and then load it back up again. But I lost the day's worth of shooting because I just absolutely forgot to take it out. And then the other camera, Paul is just tormenting me by loaning me a beautiful black Leica M4-2. I traded Paul my M3 as part of a massive swap to get the Fuji G617, and now he's torturing my soul with 4.2, which is, it's very different than shooting the 3. I didn't think it was going to be as different as it is. The feel of the camera is the M3 was much more buttery, and it actually felt a little heavier, a little bit more substantial. But the 4.2 also feels a little bit more nimble. It's a little faster to shoot. It's a little lighter, a little bit easier to handle. Of course, he had to go ahead and put is that a Summicron 35 1.5?
Some Lux 35-1.4,
which is worth more than my car and my other car combined.
I thought there was a Voigtlander lens on there.
Well, he also sent down the Voigtlander Heliar 40 2.8, and I'm just now actually, if you've heard a little buzzing in the back, I'm scanning those. Yesterday morning I went back to that church because I only got one shot. The church is it's a Methodist church from 1858. It's the second oldest building in Alachua County. And I've been shooting the exterior and the old graveyard around it for years. And I never thought about, I wonder if this church is unlocked. And I walked up and turned the handle, and sure enough, even though it's like in the middle of a pine forest and there's not another building around for a mile, this church is unlocked, and it looks like literally they had service yesterday. There are paper fans that are stacked up by the door that must be from the 1950s. And, there's the old piano in there, and there's a Bible that's open on the pulpit to the book of Psalms. And so before the hurricane hit yesterday, I took the Leica back with the faster lens and the tripod and some 800 black and white film, and shot a series of interiors with it. And I'm scanning them now, and I mean, okay, I understand why that lens is as expensive as it is now, because as I'm scanning them, I'm just looking at them going, oh, I don't think I have enough cameras that I could sell to afford this lens if I wanted to. But it's stunning. It's really fun. It's fun to shoot with. I'm going to be sad. Maybe I can afford to sell. I'm already thinking, well, if I sell my Rolleiflex, because I've got 4 TLRs and I've got the Superb, do I really need that Rolleiflex? And there are a few other cameras that I have doubles of. I'm thinking, if I sell like 8 cameras, maybe I can afford this one. So he's got me confused.
Well, that Horseman is much more affordable than that Leica.
I
Hey,
know.
I told you, Mike, he's my Huckleberry. You leave him alone.
Well, okay, so I also have recently shot a Leica that I got from Paul. This one's the M5, though. I'd always wanted to try this camera because it's always considered the ugly duckling of the M series. It was the first one with TTL metering. It's got one of the slowest meters I've ever seen in my life. Like, you have to, any exposure changes you make to the aperture shutter speed, you almost have to wait like a full second before the needle stops moving, because the meter's on an arm that moves in front of the film plane. If you even slightly, barely start to touch the shutter release, that arm starts to move back down. I mean, it takes almost no pressure, and that arm starts to move out of the way. But because it moves out of the way, that changes how much light hits it. So you start to see the needle moving. So you have to reprogram your brain that if you're going to rely on the meter, which I wanted to do because it is accurate and it works, you have to wait a full second to make sure the lighting is right. That you got your match, because you have 2 needles that need to cross.
Yeah, but it's old style CDS cells, and they are known to be slow.
Oh yeah, I mean, CDS slows are slow in any camera, but I don't know what it is about this one. But this is one of the slowest I've ever seen, and maybe that's why people don't really like these cameras. But I did really like shooting it. I like the looks of the camera. The viewfinder is great. I did have a Footlander lens on it too. It's the Nocton 21 f1.4, which is so wide. Using the auxiliary viewfinder on it, it slowed me down more than I expected, because I kept trying to use the meter. In hindsight, I probably should have done more Sunny 16 with this, and I probably could have avoided having to look at the meter, but I felt like I wanted to get the full M5 experience. But one thing I'll comment, and the reason I'm bringing it up now is because I recently wrote a review on my site about the new quick loading bottom loader Leica spools, the 3D printed ones that you can just leave in the camera. I honestly never noticed until Paul pointed it out that the Leica M5 has a unique non-removable spool. Like, the spool stays in the camera, and it's a quick load design, not entirely unlike the ones that I reviewed on my site. And it loads so easy. Like, I can't believe that they made this for the M5 and then took it away. To me, this was the way to go. It's still a bottom loader. You take the bottom of the camera off, and then there's these 2 crisscrosses in the bottom of the spool, and you essentially just push the leader in there and wind it a couple of times, and it just worked fine. I didn't trim the leader. On the first try, it loaded and attached. I had no transport problems. And that just seems like the perfect solution. So I found it interesting that spool is unique to the M5. Maybe I just got really lucky, and with future use, I'll realize that it's not as good as I'm thinking now, but I was really surprised at how easy it was to load. And one last thing I'll rave about this camera. It has one of my favorite features on a camera, which is this really large shutter speed dial that slightly overlaps the front edge of the camera. So the shutter speed dial is in front of it, and that allows you to just take your finger and vertically rotate it without having to lower it from your eye and grip it, whatever. So I found the action of changing shutter speeds on this really, really well. Loading film in it was great. Of course, it's going to make great pictures. It depends on which lens you have on it. So my takeaway from the M5 is that I was quite fond of it.
I have a tip for you.
What's that?
You may want to clean the contacts of that moving arm. If they are a bit dirty, it might also explain the slowish metering you see.
Yeah.
So the cell itself, the arm itself, the cell is visible. You're talking about just clean it with a cotton swab and some denatured alcohol or something like that?
It might help,
That's a good point because I can see it could have a buildup on it over the years. It's an older camera.
It will slowly oxidize.
I took the lens off and I'm looking
You
through
can't
the
see
lens. You can't see it though. And even if I wind it.
You can, the way you do it is you put a M mount adapter on it.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. It doesn't seem like
it's only visible when a lens or a body cap is mounted. So
Okay.
if you want to see that, take a thread mount adapter.
Okay.
And that'll
It's
fit
meant
in.
to protect the cell, of course, but
That makes sense. Yeah, I have one somewhere, just not within easy reach. But that's a good tip too. Paul, anything interesting you've been playing with down in Arizona?
Yeah, and I've been so busy. I haven't taken a picture in 3 weeks, but I have something coming up. But I'm in Arizona and I live in Ohio. And on my way home, I'll be going through Rolla, Missouri. I had a call from a friend of mine who lives 90 minutes north of Rolla, who has a Hasselblad 503 CX and 3 Hasselblad lenses and some accessories and an Arca Swiss Model B with a couple of cool lenses that he wants to sell. So I'm going to, on my way home next 2 weeks from now, he's going to drive down from Columbia, Missouri and meet me in Rolla, Missouri in a parking lot and trade cameras for money. So I'm going to be back in the Hasselblad business here pretty soon.
Well, I'm fairly certain Anthony won't want to buy that one from you.
No,
not a chance. Yeah, they're least favorite cameras ever.
Wayne, before you drop off, is there anything new that you've picked up lately or anything interesting you've been shooting?
I picked up a couple of Super Icontas a while back, gave them a full refurb. It's the 645 one, which is a 531. But I've been mainly enjoying this one.
There you go. That's the big
530
boy.
16, almost fully disassembled, but it seems to work fine now.
When Mike was down in Florida last month or 2 months ago, was it last month? This is a month ago. When he loaned me the Horseman, I loaned him one of every Super Iconta. And I'm really excited to hear his opinion of them because I love shooting those cameras. But he's got everything from the 645 to the 6x9. I didn't give him the big one. I didn't give him the 616, but he's got all the others. And he's got like that box weighed like 10 pounds.
Yeah. You will be happy to know that I just finished the rolls of film in the cameras when I was in Florida. So that just to give you an idea of how far behind I am, they are in the queue next to get loaded up. So I will have some feedback for you soon here.
I absolutely love those Super Icontas. I think that they are just really, really cool cameras to shoot.
I still need to get used to the rendering of the lens because it's a 1936 dated model. So it's an uncoated lens and just
now that's the one though, even though it's a 6x6 camera, you only get 11 exposures, right?
You only get 11 exposures.
Right. Because they couldn't figure out the film advance mechanism.
Which is strange because I fed it apart and because it was jammed up.
Yeah.
And when I assembled it together, I shot a test roll, perfect spacing.
Yeah, it's weird.
So it's weird that they couldn't get 12, but 11, no problem.
Patrick, anything new with you?
I just got a Mamiya 645, in my case, an S, which is the first generation of that camera. And I got it as a kit from a guy. And I only now realize that Mamiya's famous, the eye-level prisms, many of them have separated. And it's apparently a straightforward enough fix if you can get the prism out. But I have always, I worked for a guy who had one years ago. I've always liked 645. It's a wonderful, you get 15 exposures, you get the medium format look. I'm more of a rectangle than a square kind of guy. So I'm really liking it, except for that prism separation, which anybody in the Mamiya world knows all about that.
It goes right down the center. Yeah. Everyone I've ever seen in my life had that. Like, it's very common.
Yeah, and I understand it's a straightforward fix. There is a company in the UK and there's one in the United States that can resilver those. So that's the next step. Oh, and I'm going to get a bright screen for it as well.
From Rick Olesen?
Yeah.
It's funny. I've got a 645 with the perfect prism, and the 645 and the and my 6.7 that a friend has given me are both on the chopping blocks to get the Leica.
Well, priorities. It's all about priority.
Well, Gerjan, thank you for coming on the show. It was really fascinating. You know, Pentax is just such a great brand. I have so many different cameras that I could choose. I recently shot a Pentax Super A. This is a came out camera. This was a Japanese only model. It just feels really good on the hands. The very first Pentax I ever shot was the SV, and that's what made me fall in love with those cameras. I got a couple different lenses for it. I've already professed my love for the original Asahiflexes, the original Pentax AP. I know that's not the official name, but the original OG Pentax, the original Pentax K. I don't have as much love for the Spotmatics simply out of battery issues. They seem to be much more prone than other cameras of that era to have corroded batteries. Plus, a lot of them use the much smaller button cell batteries, which are a little bit harder to find. But overall, the Pentax system, all the way through the K mounts, there's so much to like. I love the MX. We've spoken about it before. The ME Super is a great camera. The LX would be a great camera, except for failing metering systems. But other than that, it's fantastic shooter. And you guys have touched upon the digital cameras too. Some of their DSLRs were outstanding, very, very underrated cameras too. So there's a lot to like in the system. But thank you for coming on the show. Hope you enjoyed yourself. I will include a link to your eBay store where people can order your book from you. I wrote an article on my site about the camera books that I use the most, and that was one of them, simply because it's like the definitive guide. Like pick a lens, pick one of the early bodies, and if you want to know like how to identify it, things like the makeup of the elements, just some history behind it. There's so much good stuff. And I don't even have the most current version of your book, so I need to get that. But even the first edition has a lot of terrific information in it. And I can't recommend that book enough for anybody who likes this system. You definitely want to reach out and buy this book and get it straight from the author too. You could probably buy it from a third-party seller on Amazon, but you're going to overpay, but also you're not buying it from the author. So I definitely want to support him.
Okay, thanks.
Anything else anybody else has?
Just a quick question for Gerjan.
Sure.
I've read Mike's reviews and a little bit of gas struck. Pentax K, the original Pentax K, how hard are they to find here in Europe? Because it always seemed to me like Pentax is way more popular in the States than over here.
Yeah, but the camera is rare by definition. And the strange thing is, I bought my copy in New York, in a shop in New York. But you hardly see the old Pentaxes. Yeah, you may want to check Katawiki, you may want to check eBay, but usually they're overpriced or they are not functional.
Yeah, the original one that I got, like I mentioned in my story earlier, I had to send out to be serviced because the body was in nice shape, but the shutter was shot. So that would probably be a good way to maybe look for one and see if you could find one that's not working and then just have it serviced. Because even if you find one where the seller claims that it's working, it's probably barely working. So they're going to need a CLA. But with a CLA in nice shape, they're wonderful users.
Yeah, well, you may find it difficult to find a technician who can repair cameras because he doesn't have spare parts. They are so old, those cameras. Or you may want to fuse two together to get one working. But just to mention one, I have an Asahiflex 1, which was sold only in Japan, and it's still working. And the camera is older than I am myself. Yeah, okay, I'm still working, but
luck of the draw, I guess.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. As always, the topics and discussions on the Camerosity podcast are determined by you. Well, we'll try to provide some people and topics to talk about. We do rely on your feedback and questions and ideas and such. So Paul's in Arizona, Theo's in Vietnam. We don't have anything planned yet for our next show, but be sure to keep in touch with us through our Facebook page, through Instagram, through our Discord server, or even my site. And when we're ready to announce the next episode, you know where to find us. So thanks, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.
Good night, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
I'm just going to comment that I was able to do this even though I'm in the middle of a hurricane.
Yeah.
Priorities.
Power outage. All right. Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.